Welcome, everybody, to this evening at the Institute on Religion and Democracy. I am Mark Tooley, president of the IRD, and we're just really delighted that our speaker is Ligon Duncan, president of Reform Theological Seminary, headquartered in Jackson, Mississippi, but with campuses in several other cities, including outside Washington, D.C., from which we ourselves often directly benefit with their many outstanding scholars. We're delighted that you're here. Those of you who are here physically, who are able to partake of our reception, and those of you who are watching online live, and those of you who will be watching this video posted on IRD's YouTube later on. We hope this will be a helpful, permanent resource. The talk, of course, is extremely timely about American theological education, as American Protestantism is facing an almost unprecedented churn, perhaps dating back 200 years to the Second Great Awakening in terms of how the church is reformatting, reorganizing so many denominations, and denominationalism is receding, but still strong theological traditions that are enduring, including the Reformed tradition. So to explain all of this, we have Ligon Duncan, who will share with us as long as he'd like, but perhaps for 20, 25, or 30 minutes, and then time for questions afterwards. I regret that I have an interview at about 20 minutes after 7, so I won't be able to socialize afterwards with you all, but you're welcome after the conclusion. And in fact, someone else may need to conclude this event for me. I just realized, but we'll conclude. Sarah, if you could take charge in my absence. You all are welcome to socialize and to eat and drink as long as there is food and there is drink from which to partake. But Ligon, thank you so much for coming over after a long day of 6 hours of teaching at RTS DC Cap.
Thank you so much, Mark. It is a joy to be with you, and I bring you greetings from Dr. Scott Redd, the president of our DC campus, and also Jennifer Patterson. And Scott and Jennifer have enjoyed a wonderful collaboration with the IRD over the years, have done events together, and we're thankful for what you do. I'm a beneficiary of the work that is done by this organization. I'm thankful for Mark's friendship, and I hope that I can share with you something that's not only interesting, but important tonight. Mark and I discussed various topics that might be helpful to address, and so I'm here to sort of be your Sherpa guide into the current situation in Protestant theological education, especially in North America. I could talk about some things that are happening in the world, but I think all of us are especially interested in what's going on in North America. Many of you will know that for at least 20 years, there has been significant enrollment and credit hour decline in the accredited seminaries in North America. So the Association of Theological Schools is the largest accreditor of graduate theological education in North America. They have about 275 schools that they accredit. And in that sort of collection of institutions, especially amongst the mainline Protestant institutions, there has been a very significant decrease both in enrollment and in credit hours taken. Not only that, the only growing institutions that are accredited by the Association of Theological Schools of any size are evangelical in their nature. So we're going through a real shift. If you and I had looked at the list of the largest schools 40 years ago, there would have been many mainline and liberal academic institutions in that list of the largest 20 or 25 schools. If you look at the list of the largest schools now, they're all evangelical in quality. So a lot of what I'm going to say tonight, there's sort of good news, bad news in it. And so, though none of us rejoice in the decline of once venerable institutions, it is encouraging that those with a high view of Scripture and a high view of historic Christian creedal orthodoxy are continuing to grow and flourish in the headwinds of the culture right now, even in accredited theological education. Now, here's another fact that you should know. Most of the credit hours in the schools accredited by the Association of Theological Schools are being taught by fewer schools now than they were being taught 25 years ago. So a significant proportion of the credit hours that are being taught in the ATS accredited schools are in those top 15 or so institutions. And as I mentioned before, most of those institutions are evangelical. Now, the caveat that I need to sort of add to that is increasingly, even in the accredited institutions, most of those credit hours are online. So that's part of the good news, bad news scenario. Even in the institutions that are growing, increasingly, the majority of the credit hours that they are teaching are online. Now, I'll have some things to say about that later. I'm not against online education. In fact, RTS was the first theological seminary approved by ATS to do online education. We try to do it as well as we possibly can do it, but there are some challenges, and as I'll say later on, our students today still prefer in-person residential theological education, and there's some advantages to that that can't be overcome by some of the challenges of digital or online education. Now, along with this, by any measure, we are seeing theological education become less of a requirement for ministry. Mark mentioned in his opening remarks about the denominationalism is receding. And we can have a lot of reactions to that, but one reaction that we all ought to be concerned about is one of the things that all denominations did typically at least do was, if not enforce, at least encourage certain standards of theological education for service in the ministry of the church. And as denominations recede, you're going to see less formal standards for theological education amongst the ministry of the various churches. And we're already seeing that right now. There is a rise in church-based institutions for the training of pastors and other church leaders. And of course, I think it makes perfect sense for the church to be involved in the preparation of those who are going to minister in the church. But not many churches can afford to hire an expert in Old Testament and ancient Near Eastern studies. Not many churches can afford to hire someone who is an expert in apologetics in the New Testament and early Christianity. Not many churches can afford to hire someone who's an expert in historical theology and in patristic Christianity. And so if you only have church-based training, you're going to miss some of the things that are apologetically and academically significant in the preparation of the ministry. So there's a rise in alternative educational models for the preparation of ministry. There's a rise in online education courses, and in many places there is a reduction in ordination requirements, even in denominations. I've been a part of discussions in multiple. RTS serves at any given time about 40 different denominations. About half of our students come from some kind of Presbyterian and Reformed background. Then the next biggest group is from a non-denominational or Baptist background, then Anglican, then about 38 other things at any given time. So because of that, I'm involved in multiple denominational settings discussing ordination requirements and what their ministry needs to be effective in their churches and in their service to the church. And we're seeing a reduction in ordination requirements in many denominational settings. In fact, we're seeing some denominations with no ordination requirements at all with regard to seminary education or theological preparation. And that is going to be a problem in the future. One thing about theological education that it gave us for about 200 years here in North America was a very efficient way to prepare a lot of people who are able to operate at a sophisticated level, engaging with congregation members from all kinds of backgrounds about the Word and about the history of Christianity and the whole range of theological questions. And as requirements recede, it will hurt the future ministry of the church. Now, with so many churches lowering or eliminating the requirement for formal accredited theological education, what's the future of the seminary? Well, what I would say is this: seminary is going to be here for the foreseeable future, but there are going to be fewer seminaries in the foreseeable future. And the seminaries that are going to be here are going to have to adopt certain approaches and strategies. Local church-based training for pastors and church leaders is a good thing. We like to partner with local churches in preparing pastors and church leaders. I prefer that my students are actively involved, not just participating in a local church, but even interning in local churches. That is a good thing to have that kind of practical preparation. But seminary can provide things to future ministry that cannot be provided by a local church. And so the seminaries that are here in the future are going to be the ones that are providing those things that can't be provided at the level of local church based training for pastors and church leaders. Another thing is online education, as wonderful it is, and one of the things that we try to do is every online course that we produce for students that are pursuing accredited theological education, we make available for free for those who simply want to audit the material. So I want to disseminate that information and that teaching as widely as I can and make it available to everyone. But that kind of online accredited education can't compete with what a student receives in an in-person and residential environment. You know, we know educationally you learn best in a context, number one, where you are known by the people that are teaching you and where you know that they care about you. And you learn best when you are in a cohort of fellow learners. You know, throughout my theological education, I learned as much from my colleagues as I did from my professors. And I had wonderful professors, but my colleagues were a significant part of my growth in ministry. And that's one reason why those that are doing online education are trying to pay attention to things like forming cohorts of students that are studying online together so they don't completely miss out on that in-person dynamic in theological preparation. So the MDiv programs and the seminaries that survive in the future are going to have robust components of biblical, theological, and historical and pastoral theology, things that cannot simply be duplicated by online learning or by church-based ministry, and they are going to be more personal. I find that young people today who are so much more technologically sophisticated than I was, because you're born with an iPhone in your hand and you have all of this technology, still crave in-person interaction. Our students in New York City love the personal interaction of the professors that are there present with them, and there is Washington, New York is those are technologically sophisticated places you'll find on planet Earth, but they love the in-person relational activity, and seminaries are going to have to figure out how to continue to deliver that. But many seminaries are depending upon online learning to balance the checkbook. And so the seminaries that survive are the ones that are going to be doing a good job in that in-person residential theological training. Now, what would I recommend to institutions as we face this particular situation? My recommendations would be as follows. Don't reduce the requirements for theological education. This is, you may know that probably 40 years ago, the typical seminary Master of Divinity degree had at least 100 credit hours. Now, the accreditors allow an institution to give a Master of Divinity degree with 72 credit hours. Now, many of you have master's degrees in this room, and you know that many master's degrees are between 30 and 60 hours. So a seminary master's degree actually usually has far more credit hours than a law master's degree. One of my board members did his JD, and then he went and did a master's degree in international law at the University of Edinburgh, but it was far fewer credit hours than a seminary degree would require. But if you've reduced your average credit hours from 100 to 72, you've taken away 30% of what the students are getting. And here's what we find. I ask every seminary leader I can get to talk to me about this, what are the trends that you're seeing amongst your students? And all of them tell me this: students coming to seminary today know less Bible and theology than students 25 years ago. And by the way, it's not because those students aren't smart. I love our students. They're smart, they're consecrated, they're earnest, they're eager, they want to learn. But let me say, the churches have not done a good job teaching Bible and theology. When I'm 64 years old now, I grew up in a time where almost every evangelical Protestant was in church 3 times a week. And now, with attendance patterns, committed church members are typically in the church twice a month. So when you go from being in church under teaching 150 times a year to being in church under teaching 25 times a year, it's a lot harder to convey the teaching of your church and traditions, understanding of the Bible and theology. And so the students come to seminary with that deficit, and we've got 3 or 4 years to try and make that up. And if you lower the credit hours, it makes it even harder to do that. So we've just said at Reformed Theological Seminary, we're not going to cut back on the requirements. What we've tried to say is, we're going to make sure that this does not cost you more than a degree that has less credit hours. But we can't save you the time and the work. We're gonna make you do all of the requirements of the degree, because we think when you're done, even though it takes you more time, it won't take you more money, but you will be far better prepared than a student that has not had access to all of the Bible, the theology, the church history, the ministry training. So I would urge institutions, theological institutions, especially evangelical institutions, don't cut down on your requirements. Students need more, they don't need less right now. So let's figure out how to make it affordable for students, rather and not by cutting down the requirements. Keep the requirements high, figure out how to make it affordable. So 80% of my students are on some kind of scholarship, and I'd like that to be 100%. And I'm very thankful. RTS, out of the whole of ATS, is probably in the top 1 or 2% in terms of students graduating without seminary-related debt. And with the undergraduate debt crisis in the United States, the average undergraduate student graduates with about $40,000 of debt. I do not want to add a dime to that to people that are going into ministry because they can't afford to pay it back. Even doctors and lawyers, it takes them a long time to pay back their student loans. People that want to go to the mission field, they can't pay back that kind of loans. In fact, it's interesting, there are even organizations that are rising up now to pay off debt for those that are going to the mission field or into various types of ministry. And I just don't want to add any more to that. I want students to get through as fast as possible, get as much as they can, and get to the field of ministry without adding debt burden. And I can only do that because I've got really generous donors who get what we're trying to do. But I want to encourage every theological institution to do this. And if I could just pat my friend Jason Allen on the back at Midwestern Seminary. They have recently announced a whole series of 100% scholarships. My friend David Garner at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia has announced 100% scholarships for residential MDiv and MA students. We have a whole series of 100% residential scholarships for MDiv students at RTS, and we're trying to recruit more money for more of that. So now, of course, as in all education, it's not just your tuition expenses, it's the living expenses outside. So we're trying to raise money for that as well, to help scholarship and provide stipends for living expenses for students so that we can get as many people through with as much as possible in as short a time as possible. So that's my first exhortation to institutions. Don't reduce your requirements, but do try to reduce the debt burden or the cost to your students. The second thing I would say is find ways to invest in students who have been identified by their local churches as people with potential in ministry. Identify and invest in those students who have the most potential to be future ministers and counselors and educators and missionaries. And that's where the partnership with the local church is really significant. I can't follow a student around and watch them in all their relationships and in their church life, but the pastors and elders and church members of that church see that student in his or her church life and can say, boy, this is a person who's going to be really useful in the kingdom. And so seminaries need to be very deliberate about having identified for them from the local church students with potential in ministry. Here's a third thing, and this may be the most controversial thing that I say to my fellow theological institutions. Do not rely for your tuition on Title IV loans. Title IV loans account in some institutions for upwards of 70% of the tuition dollars. And all of those loans are going to have to be paid back. So yeah, it's nice to be able to get those loans, but those loans are going to have to be paid back. So you're really shifting the debt burden for the education onto the student and off of the institution. Plus, who knows what strings are going to come attached to those Title IV loans in the future. I'm very thankful that the founders of RTS decided 60 years ago, we are not taking federal money. And we've never taken any kind, including Title IV loans, because we didn't want the strings attached. And that has helped us in this particular situation where many institutions are so dependent upon Title IV loan dollars, it's very hard for them to raise the money necessary to replace that. And we just had to discipline ourselves to deal with that many years ago. But I would encourage institutions that are using Title IV, stop using it. Wean yourself off of it and find other ways to provide for your students' tuition. Here's another word of encouragement to my fellow institutions. Require active membership and ministry of your theological faculty in the local church. I want my students to hear somebody saying to them, last week as I was working in ministry, we had this situation. 35 years ago when I was a pastor, I saw this happen. I want people preparing the future ministry of the church that are actually actively involved in the life of the church right now. Yes, I want them to be experts in their field. And that means that they can't be full-time pastors, because to be an expert in your field, well, I'm thinking of one of my professors in Orlando, Dr. Nicholas Reed, who is an expert in not only in Hebrew and ancient Near Eastern studies, but in Assyriology and a variety of other languages. Well, he couldn't be a full-time pastor in the local church and keep up the discipline that he keeps up. But he is regularly involved in the life of the local church, has worked part-time in the local church, and is able to draw on his experiences in the local church to help his students. So require active membership and ministry of your theological faculty in the church. One thing that we're going to need to do as we face the situation that is challenging seminaries today is just remember what seminaries were invented for. Seminary was invented to give the future ministry of the church a concentrated period of study with a cohort of colleagues to prepare them for a lifetime of ministry. And if seminary is adequately facilitating a biblical preparation for ministry, then that's a very good thing. Now, B.B. Warfield once said, the famous Princeton theologian, the entire work of the seminary deserves to be classed as a category of the means of grace. And he went on to say that theological education is trying to do a particular kind of sanctification. You know, every church wants to see its members sanctified. Every church wants to see its members discipled. Every church wants to see its members grow in grace. Well, seminary wants to see the ministry of the church sanctified, wants to see the ministry of the church grow in grace. And that can't just be done virtually, right? You wouldn't say to your congregation members, oh, you want to grow in grace? Watch a video. It involves personal life, relationship, character formation, growth in grace. And theological education is meant to be a means of grace in the lives of those who are going to use the means of grace in the life of God's people. So what do we aim for in confessional Protestant theological education? We aim to gather and prepare a cohort of those called by the church for gospel ministry so that they grow by grace in faith and hope and love and come to a greater knowledge and a deeper knowledge and conviction of the whole counsel of God, so that they are enabled to handle accurately and proclaim faithfully the Word of God, to pray continuously, scripturally, and earnestly, to minister the sacraments rightly, to shepherd wisely and lovingly, and who correspondingly have their own hearts filled with and their faith matured by that same grace and truth, so that their character, life, ministry, and witness are shaped by God's lavish, gracious, loving, saving work on their behalf in Christ, and by His written self-disclosure and revealed will in His Word. Now, we know that seminary can't make ministers. Only God makes ministers. But seminary is a tool. It's a means of grace. John Newton, the famous hymn writer who wrote Amazing Grace, said, "None but He who made the world can make a minister." And we know that. We know that I can't make that. But I can be a tool in the Spirit's hand to help make one of those. And so that's what I'm trying to do at Reformed Theological Seminary. So perhaps it's good for me to end here. And by the way, you can ask about this, or you can ask about anything you want to ask about in our Q&A time together. But let me just say again, what is a seminary as we're thinking about Protestant theological education in North America? Seminary is essentially a special and specific kind of the means of grace. What does it do? It cultivates doctrine and devotion, truth and love, faith and practice, mind and heart in the life of the seminarian. What does that kind of preparation produce? Ministers of the gospel who explain and enforce and apply divine truth as contained in the sacred scriptures, in order that by the agency of the Spirit and through the instrumentality of the truth, men may be first of all turned from darkness to life, and then enabled to die more and more unto sin and live more and more unto righteousness. The Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 to 5 said, the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. So he's saying all the teaching of truth in the Christian church is meant to create love to God and love to neighbor. And so I told Mark Tooley I was going to have a John Wesley quote tonight. So John Wesley's commenting on that passage, and he says this: the foundation, he's talking about the foundation of the Christian life, the foundation is faith in Christ, faith in His Word. The end is love. So the end of truth is love. Why is it so important to have evangelical seminaries? Because the culture is not out there telling you that God's truth is really important. It's not out there saying that. So somebody needs to be saying that to the future ministry of the church. But then they also need to be saying, now here's what that truth is for. The end of that truth is love in your life and in the life of your congregation, so that they love God and they love their neighbor from the deep center of their person. And we need that today, even with all the headwinds that we're facing, especially with all the headwinds that we're facing in our culture. Thank you very much for this time with you. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you'd like to mention.
Make sure you go to the mic.
Hi, Dr. Duncan. I'm Kyle Hansen. On the seminary topic, 2 questions for you. One, for American seminaries, how are they partnering with the growth of Christianity in Africa and Asia? Are they partnering with some of those communities, whether they might be a part of their denomination or not, in order to provide growing education to this explosion that's happening there? And then secondly, how can seminaries take more advantage of open online learning and then move to have students basically place out certain topic classes in order to decrease the credits and more flexible and less cost?
That's good. Okay, 2 great questions. One is, how are seminaries partnering in the work of international theological education? And I mean, the good news is there's a lot of that going on. And one of the best things that we frankly have to offer the majority world is theological education. And there's a lot of that going on. We have been working in Brazil and in Indonesia for maybe 15 years in Indonesia and about 30 years in Brazil. And I could name a number of other institutions that have significant overseas arms and works on every continent. So there is a lot of that going on. And it's both scholarshiping internationals to come to the United States and go back, but also doing theological education in the international space. So some of you may know that some graduates of the Master's Seminary and Dallas Theological Seminary started a Gulf Theological Seminary in the United Arab Emirates. And that institution is able to draw students from all over the Middle East in a whole variety of denominations. It's independent with a lot of evangelical attachments. We've had a lot of RTS professors go and teach there, and they have professors from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville go there. They have a lot of evangelical professors from the United States teaching there at the Gulf Seminary. So there's a lot of that going on, and that's a good thing. And we're all the time trying to figure out how to do that better and look cost efficiently, because what international students do not have is $60,000 to pay for an MDiv plus all the expenses that goes along with that. So if we bring them here, we've got to be ready to pay for them and help them get back to where they are needed most. If we do the work over there, we have to figure out how to finance the work from here, because there's just not going to be adequate financial support for it in the many environments that we have to work in. So I have a lot of students that come to seminary now with the vision of going internationally and serving in that kind of capacity, which just is thrilling to me. Probably for every open spot on my faculty, I get 50 or 60 resumes. So it's nice to know at least some of those folks want to go overseas and serve there, where we have a surfeit of riches here. And there are many places where there are just not that many opportunities to have the highest quality. So there is a lot of good work going on in that area. Now, with regard to doing things like, what about open learning? What about students placing out of courses and such? There are a lot of partnerships that are being done with undergraduate institutions to replace certain basic level courses at the seminary so that the students can get their degree more quickly, sort of go through undergraduate to graduate in 5 years as opposed to 7 years. So there are a lot of institutions that are thinking that through, and accreditors are looking at that closely right now. And I'm looking at it closely too. We have RTS is a little bit unusual. One of the things that's happened in theological education is the average age of those in theological education is climbing. Now, we actually have sort of the younger end of the population of students. So if I have a 22-year-old, I'm not so anxious to push him or her out quickly into ministry. I'd rather those people get some ministry experience in the local church setting before they're out on the field. So if you do a 3-2 model, which many schools are doing, 3 years in undergraduate, Bible college, covering some of your major basic courses in seminary, and then 2 years in seminary, and you've started Bible college at 18, you're 23 when you're getting out. And the market may be hard for you there at 23 because everybody wants you to have 10 years of experience, right? You know, that's so I am looking at that, and we're trying to find ways to make seminary more cost effective, but at the same time not short-circuiting the experience opportunities that they get in seminary. I'm, as Mark said, I'm based in Jackson, Mississippi. I'd never been to Mississippi in my life until I went to interview for the job in 1989, and I've been there ever since. And we're a very small market compared to Washington, D.C. I mean, how many people are in the metropolitan area here? 6 million people or more in the metropolitan area? Well, that's twice the population of Mississippi. And so the metropolitan area of our largest section of the state has less than 500,000 people. But you may also know that Mississippi has the highest percentage of church attendance for Protestants in the Western world. So, Poland has the highest attendance for Catholics. Utah has the highest attendance for Mormons. Mississippi has the highest attendance for Protestant Christians. Yay, Southern Baptists and Bible-believing Methodists. That's why we have those kinds of statistics in Mississippi. But because of that, even though we're a small market, I've got 50 paid internships that my students can take there. And that's very economical for them. It helps finance their education. My little speech that I give to those pastors is, have paid interns and pay for their seminary tuition. It will be a win, 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 win. It'll be a win for the student because they won't have to pay their tuition for theological education, and they'll have some stipend money to live with on the side. And they'll get experience in the local church. So that's sort of 3 wins for the price of 1 right there, okay? So it's a win for the student. It's a win for me because I don't have to go out and raise that tuition money. It's a win for the church because they will get the cheapest help they'll ever pay for. You'll get some really outstanding interns that you would pay a lot of money for just a few years later to be on your pastoral staff, and the church will really benefit. But it's also, number 4, a win. It's a win for the future church, because those people are really being equipped. So I'm trying to think of ways like that I can lower the costs, be really, really efficient with getting people out. Here's another thing you need to know. In seminaries where the majority of the credit hours are being taught online, it is taking a majority of those students more than 10 years to complete an MDiv program. Okay, I think that's way too long. I don't mind a student taking 5 years while they're working in a church and being residential, but I don't want a student to take 10 years. I want to get them out there on the field. So I am trying to figure out ways to get them out more quickly. I don't want 10 years. I don't want them necessarily to be 23 and going out to the work. I mean, maybe there's some that are ready at 23. I wasn't ready at 23. I was a youth director at 23, and I needed to be a youth director at 23. I was a youth director from 22 to 26, and I needed those 4 years of working with youth before I was ready to go on and do something else. But I do want to get people out quickly. I don't want them to take 10 years to be prepared to go to the field. Those are great questions.
Hello, Dr. Duncan. I'm Harry Modinger, and I'm curious your thoughts about the seminaries that used to be orthodox in terms of high view of Scripture and divinity of Christ that have kind of left that. And if there's anything that we as evangelicals can do to help bring the gospel back into those seminaries and revitalize them.
Yes. Couple of things have happened in those institutions. Theological liberalism was on a roll from about 1800 to about 1950. I mean, it was sort of sweeping everything before its before its way, and then about 1950, it hit a downturn that it's never been able to recover from. And so, whereas theological liberalism won all of the main academic institutions in the United States over the course from the late 19th century into the early 20th century, all of those denominations went into decline in the mid-20th century. And when they went into decline, the seminaries went into decline. And partly, it's just a demand thing. RTS started with 15 students in 1966. We now teach more credit hours to students preparing for the ministry than all of the PCUSA seminaries combined. If you had said that to somebody in 1966, they would have said, you're smoking something, but that is what's happening. And largely, that's a supply and demand thing. They're just not the jobs in those mainline churches to justify the seminary credit hours that they used to teach. So that's one thing that has happened. Now, I think evangelicals are actually doing a very good job right now at doing high-level academic scholarship that is faithful to historic, creedal, and confessional Christianity. I can point to Southern Seminary in Louisville. I can point to Concordia Seminary, Lutheran Seminary in St. Louis. I can point to Asbury Seminary and Wesley Seminary in the Methodist world. I can point to Westminster in California and Covenant Seminary and Westminster in Philadelphia in the Presbyterian world. And RTS, we're trying to do our part too. So there's some really happy things happening there. One example would be 40 years ago, if you had been studying text and canon of Scripture, the scholars that you would have had to have read would have been mainline scholars. Right now, if text and canon is your issue, Mike Kruger and Chuck Hill and John Mead at Phoenix Seminary, they're the guys in that field. I mean, evangelicals are leading scholars in really important areas of academic education. So I think we're doing a good job in that area. Now, can you win back some of those institutions that have been lost? Most of them seem to me to be impervious to reform because they've got huge endowments and they don't need students. I mean, they don't. Princeton's endowment is $1.5 billion. The library at Princeton has a larger endowment than most evangelical institutions. So they don't, there's no influence, students decide they're not going to go, doesn't matter. They can just keep on going with no students. Now that is what's going to happen. I mean, we see this in churches too, right? You'll have churches with endowments and no members. So they've got a church staff of 3 and a congregation of 5, and they've got an endowment, and so they can keep the church doors open indefinitely. That's going to happen in a lot of liberal academic institutions.
Thank you, Dr. Duncan. Caleb here. You've talked a lot about the decline of the mainline denominations, but I really want to hone in the past 5 to 7 years in terms of what's been going on in the church. There have been some great seminaries ascending, especially in terms of the COVID years.
Yes.
I was kind of wondering, are there any unique factors in terms of going on in, let's just say, PRTS or Greenville that's causing them to bubble up now as they are? So.
Okay, he's mentioned a couple of smaller institutions that maybe weren't on people's radar, 10, 15 years ago. PRTS, that's Joel Beakey out of the Heritage Netherlands Reformed background, so a lot of Dutch Reformed influence there. They're in Grand Rapids, Puritan Reformed Theological Seminary. I don't. It's got to be just like 20 years old. It's not old, but they have really grown, and they've got a very impressive faculty, and they are really reaching out internationally. They have little pods all over the world. That, like, I was in Alexandria and Cairo a year or so ago, and they've got a thing going on in Alexandria and Cairo for PRTS. Greenville Seminary is another example. Jonathan Master, who was at Cairn University in Philadelphia, recently became the president at Greenville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and he has really upped their game in terms of the quality of the faculty and what they're doing. And so there are some things like that going on that are very, very encouraging. And I'm not sure it's COVID related. I think it's people in that neck of the woods. There is a growth in Reformed theology going on in the culture. In Greenville, South Carolina in the 1970s, I'm not sure many people would have known what Reformed theology was. I was a teenager then. Now it's a thing. I don't think we realized that there was a growth in the movement of Reformed theology that sort of started in the late 1960s, and it really picked up with the battle for the Bible. So if you remember the Harold Lindsell and then the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy, a lot of the people that were involved, whether they were Lutheran, Baptist, Reformed, Congregational, Independent, they were Reformed in their soteriology, or what John Piper calls big God theology. And what happened was that kind of theology got fed into multiple denominational traditions. And by the way, you're seeing right now, even in denominations like the CRC, the Christian Reformed Church, sort of a recovery of confessional Reformed theology. It's quite encouraging going on. So I think that's part of what's going on with a PRTS and a Greenville seminary. But in our neck of the woods, and of course I've told my friends at Wesley and Asbury, the Global Methodist Church is going to be a blessing for you, because you're exactly the kind of institution that Bible-believing Wesleyans and Methodists are going to want to have. They don't want to go to an institution that doesn't believe in the Scriptures and doesn't believe in the Apostles' Creed and the great affirmations of faith. So there are good things happening in multiple denominational traditions that explain why those evangelical seminaries are doing well. Yeah, great question.
I think I'll make myself the final question,
Good.
Ligon, and it's a somewhat controversial question. So if you want to obfuscate, that's fine.
Thank you for the out, Mark. Thank you for the out. Yeah.
But this week we had Doug Wilson in town speaking at a conference, and some similarly minded people who come from the Reformed school of thought, who self-identify as Christian nationalists and who advocate for some kind of religious establishment,
Right.
saying this is intrinsic to the Reformed tradition. I know that's not the perspective of RTS. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that the debate upon the relationship between church and state is an old debate even within the Reformed community. And we speak, for instance, of the 16th century reformers as the magisterial reformers, because their reform did have a significant impact on the nation states in which they operated. And there was a particular type of relationship between church and state in those nation states. But when Reformed theology came to America, the Westminster Confession itself and its chapter on church and state was amended to go from articulating an establishmentarian view of the relationship between church and state to a voluntarist view of the relationship between church and state. And that has been the majority report in the Reformed community since then. I will say I do find it odd that there would be a rising call for establishmentarianism when we have never been further from the possibility of establishmentarianism in the history of our republic. I mean, that's why I call it role play, because you cannot get, it can't happen. And so I don't want to see people divided over a theoretical commitment that has no possibility in reality. Yes, we are in a really weird time in our culture. And yes, I want Christians speaking into every sphere of our culture, whether it's education or politics or serving as civil servants. And that's a wonderful thing, and the church needs to equip our people to do that. But the idea that what we really need now is Christendom or establishmentarianism, when you couldn't get 1% of the population to support you in that. You really have to be a hardcore postmillennialist to be committed to that. And then you have to think that postmillennialism is going to happen really fast to be committed to that kind of approach. So I want us to think seriously about the kinds of issues that we're facing today. And I know that people look at our culture right now and they're fearful for what it's going to mean for religious liberty, for what it's going to mean for Christianity. And I think, that's one reason I'm thankful for people like you, Mark. You've been trying to help us think hard about that for a long time. And so those of you that are working here at IRD, keep working hard on that. We need to think about that and think about that hard. But I don't want to see either the Reformed movement or the evangelical movement divided over something that we have never been further from, even if we thought it was the right thing. And I also think, and I've said this before too, most of and this is where our conversations with our international friends really help us. Our evangelical friends in China are not trying to figure out how to do establishment in China right now, And in fact, establishment in China is the problem, because you've got establishment in China and it's not working real well for us as Christians. So something is going to be established. I understand that. But I do believe that the way Protestants understood the relationship between church and state in our founding was very wise in light of what had happened in established churches all over Europe. Establishment did not work out very well for evangelical Christianity. And that's why we ended up with voluntarism in the United States, in the colonies, and then in the States when we became a nation. So those are some of my thoughts, Mark.
And you didn't obfuscate at all. So
Good.
And Dr. Duncan, thank you so much for your leadership and for your insights and for being with us here this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for